Alrighty, I called to order our November 15th, 2024's Budget Finance and Growth Committee meeting. We have a packed house of wonderful folks here. So as we have done, because the prior budget chair always did it, so I will do it as well. We'll go around the room, introducing who's all here. We will start with Ms. Davis.
Good morning, Jennifer Wagner, Treasurer and Chief Financial Officer.
Good morning, Michael Guspin, Assistant Treasurer. Kevin Ashley, Director of Financial Reporting and Transparency.
Good morning, Lauren Roberts, Chief Audit Executive.
Ben Lindy, Board Member.
Brandon Craig, Board Member.
Good day, Shauna Murphy, Interim Superintendent.
Adam Besser, Instructional Materials Manager.
Good morning, Cody Hutchins, Contract Analyst.
Chris Burkhardt, Chief Operating Officer.
Jessica Shelley, Director of Student Dining Services.
All right. Josh Harden, Director of Athletics.
Demetrius Martin, Director of Transportation.
Michelle Dunn with Cincinnati Federation of Teachers.
Jeremy Gullihue, Chief Information Officer.
Thanks everybody for being here today. Want to just start quickly with our old business updates, and just want to let folks know that we still have the treasure search going pretty well here. The board members had no, is it not working? Here. Okay. No, I missed board member Crossett just showed up too. Great. That's great. Are there any other seat? You're welcome to. All right. Yeah. With regards to the treasurer's updates, is our old business part is that we have working with the OSBA to put together our materials to go out so that we can have something posted soon. The plan is to have something posted in the next month. And then from there, we will open up to folks to apply, board review those folks, and ultimately with the assistance and counsel of stakeholders, including our audit committee, as well as other members of the team and other members of leadership, make a decision on our next treasurer, given that our current treasurer refuses to keep working for us for the rest of her life. So we are steady on our way, and look out for materials coming out with regards to the posting itself. That is the update from there. We are now going to move to our new business, and again, as I talked about before, we had to move the mics around because we had to make sure we got it back to Sir Burkhardt with our facilities repair plan update.
Yeah, thank you. And so as we look at capital improvement, next slide, Rob. The question is always asked, why are we talking about this now, and why has this come up many times in the past year to 2 years in relation to capital improvement and the budget? So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about why it's needed, a little bit behind the methodology, how we put together the numbers and what's needed, and kind of go through that plan a little bit, as well as finally talk a little bit about our custodial side of the buildings and how we are right sizing. So starting off from the capital improvement side, we know that here in CPS, we had the master facilities plan that was finished well over a decade ago. So that means most of our buildings are new as of 10, 15, or 20 years ago. Now, anyone who's ever owned a house, had an apartment, or bought anything of value, you know that approaching 10 years, you have some maintenance that needs to happen. When you start approaching 15 years, that maintenance becomes a little bit more extensive. And once you hit 20 years, that maintenance is pretty extravagant, and there's a lot that needs to happen. Nothing is different from our buildings in that regard as well. So in some of our buildings, we're hitting the 10 to 12 year mark, and others we're hitting the 15-year mark, and others we're hitting the 20-year mark. When you consider the expanse of our buildings, how many square feet we have, how many inner workings we have, you'll, as I go through the actual process, you'll see that this is rather large in scope. So what we did is we started looking at what needs to be done on a timeline schedule, i.e., we know that roofs need to be replaced anywhere from 20 years to 30 years. So, we start there and we look at how many work orders have we had? What has been the life of it, for a roof, carpeting, painting, HVAC. So we started looking at those things. We knew that we needed a holistic approach. So as we looked at the building, we tried to look from floor to ceiling, including roofs, and then back down, and then looking at the whole grounds. So we wanted to make sure that this wasn't just a flash in the pan, that we were saying, hey, we need this right now. Everything that we're doing is on a timeline so that we can systematically look over the next 2 to 3 decades. What is this going to look like? Next slide, Rob. So as we looked at the methodology, again, we wanted to be comprehensive in everything that we looked at. We really started also looking at our work orders. So how many times have we gone out to the HVAC at Aiken, for example, and repaired it? How many times have we gone over to Carson and looked at the roof? And so we start there, as well as looking at what was the useful life of what we put in from a standpoint of the facility master plan. So if we put in HVAC and we thought that that was going to last 25 years, we know we're 17 years in. So what does that look like between now and then? Also knowing that even though something is rated to last 25 years, it isn't always rated 25 years. So we all know we all have warranties on cars when we buy them, and those warranties never last as long as we or the work never lasts as long as we think it should. So we identified work that was pushed multiple years as well. So as we looked at our budget gaps, in some years, maybe we were supposed to replace a roof or we're supposed to replace AC. What does that look like now? How many years have we pushed that work to the current? So we wanted to make sure that we right size those as well. We also looked at some outside contractors to help us through some of this. We have experts within CPS, but we also have some really detailed folks who really get into the weeds on some of the work as well. So I'd like to say we have some general practitioners from a doctor level in CPS. We also have some specialists within CPS, but we also have some specialists among specialists outside in our community who help us put this together as well. The last thing I want to say from this standpoint is the cost estimates that you will see are just that, they're estimates. In a lot of cases, we've actually gotten boots on the ground estimates on what it would cost back in 2023 when we started this process. But over the years, we also have inflation that will happen. We also have cost of the materials that will ebb and flow. So when we have the estimates there, that means what we think that's going to cost moving forward, not necessarily actually having a quote for those items at that standpoint. Next slide, Rob. So there's a lot of areas of focus here, and this is quite extensive. Don't mean to bog us down with looking at the minutia here, but we looked at everything from athletic fields. Yes, Josh, we had multiple conversations about athletic fields to door hardware. So really the gamut of everything within the district. We tried to make sure that we were 100% comprehensive on everything that we were looking at. There are some items that you will not see on here, and those are really our low level items. So we tried to look at items that were not only the same across the entire district to make sure we had parity, but if it was something that we could incorporate into our regular budget, you're not going to see that. So if it's something that is, hey, we need to replace these alarms at some of these buildings and the cost is only going to be like $25,000. We didn't necessarily put that on this is because we can do that on a regular basis within our current budget structure. What is on here are things that are above and beyond our regular budget structure from a facility standpoint. So as we go to the next slide, you'll see the 5-year estimated costs. So we start off with 41 million in fiscal year 26. then again 33, 31, 38, and 24. Although those, have a little bit of a wave, a little bit of a sine curve from year to year, and the cost is over the 5 years, close to $170 million. We know that the exact amounts per year aren't set in stone. So as we look at, for example, roofing that we need to do in fiscal year 26, we've actually rolled up some projects from 23 and 24 into 26, which is why 26 is a little bit higher, but knowing that we can't do all of that work in 1 year. So once we figure out exactly what we can do, maybe one or two of those roofs are pushed to 27. We'll look at the scope and see what that looks like in its entirety. As we look at all the projects, so I'll ask you, Rob, to click on the 5-year plan. And this is quite extensive. So I don't know, it's probably not going to show up really well on the screen. I'll ask those folks in the room if you want to click on that on your device to kind of scroll through that. On the left, we have the major category, and those are the categories that I talked about previously, from athletic fields to boilers to camera systems. If you actually click on athletic fields, it will also give you the detail within that on the year and the expense. So we have it broken down that way as well, and which schools will get what in what years. If you can click back, Rob. But as we go from left to right, you can see in what fiscal year and what scope of work is actually being done with a total per line item. So you'll see a total for athletic fields, you will see a total for door hardware, you will see a total for cameras, you will see a total for vehicles, and that will go through the entire process all the way through. We do have some items that are highlighted in a cream color. I didn't want to put red because it would not show up well on this, but the cream color ones that are what we would consider to be safety related. So things like cameras, things like alarms and fire suppression and fire alarms are on there. You will also see parking lots, and maybe you'll say, well, why are parking lots a safety issue? Obviously, as students and staff are walking through parking lots, and when we say parking lots, those are a lot of paved areas. The slips, trips, and falls are ratcheted up when there's potholes, when those areas are in disrepair. So those are under safety as well. Obviously, playgrounds are on there as well. We want to make sure all of our playgrounds are safe. A lot of our playgrounds are getting to their useful life, whereby we have replaced as many components as you can, just like a car. At some point, you have to stop replacing components and start replacing the entire structure. So same type of thing there. So I don't want to spend a lot of time. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, but I just kind of want to highlight how we went about doing it. We also systematically, through the plan, made sure that, for example, carpeting, we haven't replaced carpeting in most schools in well over 10 to 12 years. We're trying to get on a 7 to 8 year cycle on replacing carpeting. We're trying to get on a 7 to 9 year cycle on repainting walls. So if you go into one of our buildings and you might see walls in disrepair or maybe need an upgrade, or carpeting that may need an upgrade, these are $1 million decisions just to paint walls in schools or to replace carpeting. So we wanted to be systematic about our approach to say, as we move forward, we're going to replace these schools over a 7-year period. And then after that 7-year period, we're starting that process over again. So we know what those costs actually are. As we transition to the next slide, switching gears a little bit, this kind of goes hand in hand with the maintenance of the buildings, but also goes to building cleanliness. And so we hear a lot of times that, hey, there's repairs that need to be done in the buildings, but maybe the building isn't as clean as we would like it to be. And we acknowledge that. Our cleaners and our custodians, building engineers and custodial supervisors really take great pride in making sure that the buildings are clean, ready, safe for all of the community to come in and use them. The one thing that I put on this slide here is, and this is a excerpt from the APA manual, which is the Association of Physical Plant Administrators. And what this shows is, as you are staffing buildings based on square foot, what the different levels, level one being pretty much spotless. Think about a hospital or operating room. And that's 8,500 square feet per individual, to an area level 5, which is unkept and neglect, which would be somewhere around 45,000 square foot per employee. And we're talking about an employee who's working an 8-hour shift in a typical environment. And when we say typical environment, we're talking, for example, classroom or meeting space. We're not talking about athletic fields or gymnasiums or some of those larger areas. So the one thing to call out here is, based on CPS cleaning levels, we're at 28,763 square feet. So as you look at this chart, you'll see that we are on the backside of level 3, in between level 3 and level 4, which is casual inattention and moderate dinginess. And so that's our staffing level within CPS, and that's the level in which all of our schools are based on an average basis. I'll get to the per square foot in a minute, but I also want to call out here that within that, we also have facility use outside of a regular school day. We don't staff based on those facility use because they are not regular in nature. So when we look at this 28,763 square foot, and we see that it's on the backside of level 3, when we do have some of those facility use, and those are not paid facilities, i.e. there's not someone coming in from outside the district and renting the facility for a cost, but if there's something happening within our district, we use that same labor to cover that. So if there's, for example, a dance after school, and we are using the gymnasium, the cafeteria, the hallways, the same staff that is there through the day then has to displace their work to then get those things cleaned as well. So it's a trade-off. So there's a lot of times that folks will come into a building and say, well, this wasn't done last night, or this wasn't done for the start of school. Sometimes other things that have to take priority, i.e. cleaning up a gymnasium, cleaning up a cafeteria, getting hallways ready. And so by default, someone can't be in 2 places at one time, and something has to be moved to the next day and then try to catch up from there. If you click on the custodial per square foot, that'll give you a square foot. So in the first column, or in column D, it will tell you how many square feet per employee, and column C, how many positions that is within CPS. What I really want to highlight is column E, F, and G. So as we look back at that scale, that 5-point scale that we talked about, level 1 being spotless, level 2 being ordinary tidiness, and level 3 being casual inattention. What would it take for us to get to level 3 wholeheartedly? What would it take for us to get to level 2? And what would it take for us to get to level 1? So if you scroll down to the bottom of this document, all the way at the bottom, you will see that to get to level 3, it would take an additional 17 custodians at a cost of about $1 million. If we get to level 2, and that's our standard that we want to hit, we would have to add about 152 custodians at about $8.5 million in salary. If we really wanted to be spotless and orderly and making sure that nothing is left to chance within our district, that would cost additional $28 million to get to that level of cleanliness. And these are standards that buildings use all across the US. These are standards that are not only for school districts, but also, office buildings, hospitals, and other commercial buildings. So we do know that there's a little play here. Not every district is the same. We utilize our district a lot after hours for a lot of community events. And so that goes into how we try to staff our buildings as well. So I know there's a lot of questions. Hopefully I gave you at least an overview or 50,000 foot view on how we have looked at the work of not only what needs to be done from a facility standpoint over the next 5 to 7 years, but also how we go about staffing the buildings for cleanliness.
All righty. Superintendent Murphy, did you have anything to add to before we get into questions?
Very thorough report.
All righty. Treasurer White.
Can you go back to the 5-year amounts where it has the years? Please. Okay, so he has this plan starting in 26. Keep in mind that we need new money to pay for this, either through a PI or a big operational levy or something. If it goes on the ballot in 26, you don't actually start collecting money until January 28th.
Okay,
Because property taxes are a year in arrears, unless you put the language in there that says immediate collection, and then it backwards looks at that year and you can start collecting immediately in January, but. At the earliest, if you go November 26th, the earliest you get money is either January 27 or 28, so that backs up that whole plan, which means it increases because of inflation.
good to know. Yeah. Are there questions from board members? Or thoughts from board members? Dr. Moffett, and welcome to the.
Please forgive me for being late. I apologize to the chair as well. I do have a couple of questions, and I think they're really kind of comments / questions and then some ideas to the board. I know for a fact that we've got alumni associations that want to help like paint buildings. We've got churches that rent our facilities and also want to do those things. Has there been any consideration around soliciting partnerships to get some of this done, especially those partnerships that use our buildings weekly? For instance, there's a church that meets, I know at Withrow, and it's a pretty nice sized congregation, and they asked what could they do. And for us as a board, I've always heard before I got on the board, oh, we can't do that. You know, outside people are not allowed to come in and paint. We have to buy a paint from certain vendors. We have to have the certain colors. So the community's perception is that there are limits that we're placing on the community to assist us. Is that true, or has there been any consideration, collaborations, grants, partnerships? Is there anything that we can do? I know Esther's gone.
Yeah.
I know Esther's gone.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what creatively have we explored around getting some of this done? Especially when you're talking about cleanliness and carpets 10 years long, that's a lot. So
Yeah. So great question, a lot to unpack there. So I'll try to be comprehensive in my answer. If I miss something, please call me out and ask deeper. So yes, we do that right now. We do have groups that come in that do those types of things. For example, we have groups that come in and will do some mulching, some landscaping at some of the fronts of our schools that we just can't do ourselves. And so we do that, but we also do that with a caveat is we want to make sure that whatever is put in can be maintained. So we look at, and this is really deep in the weeds, and pun intended, is we look at the foliage, we look at the trees that we're putting in, we're looking at the bushes that are being put in, we look at the type of mulch that's being put in to make sure it meets our district standard and that it's not going to cause us more work in the long run. So that's one area that we look at. And we do that, for example, I'll use an example that happened just recently is Roberts got, we contracted through a group came in and they got the paint donated and painted a lot of Roberts, for example. So that was something that we had to make sure the paint color was appropriate. We had to make sure the paint was institutional paint. So there's some caveats that we have to make sure. You can't just go to Lowe's, Home Depot, or Menards and buy a can of paint and slap it on the walls. We want to make sure it's appropriate for. So that's why we kind of push back a little bit or take a step back a little bit and say, okay, you can do this, but only under these certain circumstances. Within that, within a couple of situations, we've had some folks come in and be well-intentioned, but also cause us more work on the back end. So for example, if they're not painters, if they're just people who, you know, paint or have painted at home, that's not necessarily the same. And so we've had to re-strip and wax floors because, you know, folks have splattered paint or didn't get the drop cloths exactly in the right place, which then causes us more work. So I say that to say we love our partners, absolutely. But we want to make sure that as we put our partners in place to help us, that we're doing it for actually help for the long term. So we're not doing something that will cause us more work or more cash flow in the long run.
thank you for that. That definitely answered it. Do we have a formalized process so that if people or organizations want to do something, there is a checklist? And I guess to the board members, I don't think it's a policy that they can't, but I've been told that, you know, hey, we can't. Do we have that process formalized so that if an organization wants to come in, I know
Yeah.
Crossroads Church did a community day and
Yeah.
they want to do things around places around the city.
Yeah.
but what is the process that they would go through to do
Yeah,
some
so
improvement?
that's a great question. So we have two different processes. One is a formal process that we follow, and one's an informal. So our formal process is happens once a year. By January 1st, each principal will talk with their community folks to figure out what needs to be done at the school. And we take all of the requests, whether they're internal or external, to say what needs to be done at all the schools. So one principal may say, I want a wall put up. Another may say, I want my landscaping redone. One may say, I want to put a shed out back or something along those lines. We look at all of those holistically across the district and say, what do we have funding for and what can we do within the year? So that's our formal process, and that happens once a year.
Gotcha.
Informally, though, and this is where a lot of them happen, is they will go to the principal will send them over to facilities or my office, and then we will sit down and talk through each of those along the way.
Okay.
A lot of those are grant funded. So for example, right now we're looking at Hughes at doing a upgrade to their health clinic. And so that was grant funded. So they came to us and said, even though it's outside of our typical window, here's the grant funding, here's the time that we can do it. So we start working along those lines and doing that. That's a lot of how it happens,
Okay.
truly. We would like it to be, once a year so we can fold that into all of our project district wide. So we're not, oh, this popped up and oh, this popped up. We're really more strategic about our plan, but we do look at those times as well as things come up and as money comes up. We don't want to turn that away, so we do
Yeah.
it when we can.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brennan, and thanks for the presentation, Chris and team. I think my first question is, how can we help? What do you have an ask of us? What
Mhm.
can we do that's helpful for you all?
A couple asks, I would say one is, as you looked at the building cleanliness, I think one of the things that our community doesn't realize is our after hours funding doesn't necessarily cover the building costs. And that's one thing that we constantly struggle with as we have building usage and we want the community to use our facilities, but that also comes at a cost. Like we have to make sure that as we have custodians cleaning up either athletic fields and or gymnasiums and or those cafeterias or some of those larger areas, that is actually coming out of the staffing for the school. And so it's a zero sum game. Is this is the amount of money, this is the time, this is the resources we have to devote towards it. So sometimes folks in the community may say, oh, why is it costing me to rent the building if they're an outside organization? And so getting that word out is helpful to everyone. I think the other piece is just awareness, is that we as you look at the 160 million, this obviously didn't happen overnight. And so as we continue to put new projects and expand the district with some great things that we're doing, we also need to fund them more long-term. And I'll utilize or point at some of the areas that during COVID, we did some great expansions. We've added a lot of square footage to our district. In a previous presentation, I showed that HVAC costs have gone down, even though we've added, hundreds of thousands of more square feet, but we also have to staff that and clean that. So the expansions at Hyde Park, the expansions at Pleasant Ridge, the expansions at Walnut and some of those others, even though we looked at the one-time cost, we also need to look at the reoccurring cost over the years to keep that as pristine as it was built. Is that helpful? Did that answer?
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. What I hear you saying is there are messages we could communicate more clearly and more frequently about the cost of maintaining facilities when they're used after school hours. Is that, yeah?
Yes.
I just a couple of, we have kind of time. I mean, it's timely. This makes me think of something, and then I had two other very short things. We just met as a policy committee on Wednesday, and we were looking at the facilities use policy. And so because this had come up in the context of some football games and some safety issues, and we were really looking at it through the lens of security and then insurance coverage. But one thing we did not talk about really was this issue, and we just talked about this Wednesday. Have you ever chatted with Dan, or I mean, we have Josh, like people who use that policy, and like, is this a part of that in a meaningful way?
It is, and Dan and Josh and I have ongoing conversations about facility rental, facility usage, how we make first and foremost, we want to make sure our internal operations and organizations are being able to use our facilities. And then secondly is how do we then offer those services to the outside folks who want to come in and utilize our facilities, as well as knowing that not everyone has the ability um to pay for or fund, what their ask is. For example, I'll use a Boy Scout troop that might want to utilize one of our classrooms during, after hours. It might be cost prohibitive for them to utilize that. So
Yeah.
our constant discussion is how do we open up our buildings knowing there's a cost to clean that room and knowing there's a cost to turn on the HVAC and the lights and all those other things, and do that, in a responsible manner, but also doing it so it meets our budget. So it's someplace else, something's got to be cut. And so when we're in a budget cycle and what we've had to work through for the past, kind of 24 months is how do we do all this in a synergistic way versus just saying no. And so I think we're constantly at the how do we get more creative in this?
Yeah, and that makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. These are topics I can flag for a future meeting, but what I didn't hear was, and not that there's no should behind this, but like a proposal that we go for this public money in X levy cycle or in Y manner. Like I didn't hear that. Whenever we get there, questions I have are things like, if the facilities master plan was 10 years, this is 5 years. Why the difference? Just interested in that. And then I found very helpful these benchmarks for industry standards. I would also be interested in, like, if we're going to have to go to the public and ask for money for something, how CPS compares to other school districts. It's not instead of. I think this is very helpful. It's just it would be nice to be able to say what we're trying to do is at least keep up with or be slightly better than. And so that would just be information to be helpful later on. That's all. Thank you.
I'll be very quick, because I love to keep the meeting going, but I appreciate you coming and doing this presentation and again, doing it really kind of, we'll say last minute. I think I asked you like 3 weeks ago, but I appreciate bringing this back to our forefront because it is a part of the conversation we're going to have to ultimately have with regard to how all of our buildings are used. One of my concerns, and you brought it to us a year and a half ago, I guess, or so, was that we have a number of facilities where we are hoping that nothing no big catastrophe happens in the city that would result in something major happening. And I think, we experienced this a few years ago or I think it was either last year or the year before, where someone drove into a building, right? That's an expense that is not on the plan of facilities master plan. But when that happens, a lot of work is needed to repair the building, to get things straightened out. But then it also is a potential new item to add to the facility repair plan, depending on what structural damage may have done to other things that were already vulnerable. Right. And so I think about a lot of places we thankfully, knock on wood or whatever, we have not had some major natural disaster come through in the same way that other places have. But, a building floods. And what does it do to the electrical system? What does that do to the heating and HVAC? What does that do to all these other things that may not have been a priority, but become one as a result? And so I think having building a new facilities master plan that also thinks about those sudden costs that may come up is a good plan to do.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Since I've been here, we've had 3 cars that have hit buildings. I don't know if it's me or if it's just a fluke, but those are things that we have to deal with. If those folks are uninsured, which happens, we don't have insurance to cover those types of things. And so we could have $100,000 damage to our building or to a facility that we have to find money within our own budget to stand up. And typically over the course of the year, we'll have 2 or 3 of those types of things, not car sitting buildings, obviously, but 2 or 3 of those things that we didn't anticipate that could be an act of God, a tree falling or something that causes us to do that. So to your point, yes, there we have to also build in some wiggle room for those things that we don't anticipate. And that's really tough. To that point too, one of the things that is on the list is vehicles. As our vehicles, average life of our vehicles are 12 years old right now. That is going to, if we wait 2 more years, that becomes a 15-year-old vehicle. We had situations where, we are welding to the bottom of the vehicle some metal so that you can't see through the bed of the truck into the ground below, and we've done that as a stopgap measure. But we really, as you're looking at both electric vehicles costing more as well as commercial vehicles costing more now after COVID, you're looking at a huge expense that we need to now hopefully get our fleet to a 7 or 8 year life is really the sweet spot. And we're almost double that right now. So to your point, yes, there's a lot of those things that I'm looking at. And to just one last thing, our goal with this is also to be cyclical. So everything that we've put in place over this 5 years, and we can elongate it to 7, is hopefully we can get this cyclically every 7 years. These things happen. So if Withrow was painted in 2026, 7 years later, Withrow gets painted again. And we look at those and based on wear and tear, we might move those up a year or back a year. But truly, we need to get to a point where we have a cyclical piece, knowing in 15 years from now what those things that are going to need to happen.
I think, and I think the only other thing I will add to this, and again, to keep us moving, but is I think the other part that we have to talk about within any facilities master plan that we come up with is also addressing how do we make our schools more technologically up to date. Because I do think one thing that I think was true about some of the things within the facilities master plan or facilities ideas that were being proposed there were things that would actually might eventually save us dollars in how we do things or how we operate or how we perform tasks. One of those things also can be technology. Technology is a great way to bring new opportunities into a classroom, to bring new experiences in. Having walked through the grand opening or whatever for the new work at Pleasant Ridge Montessori, one of the things that I heard a number of the teachers talk about is the ability to have stuff like the touchscreens and these type of things in the classroom. That's how kids are learning now, right? Like that's the way some of these kids are so used to seeing things and experiencing things. And even one of the things that I thought of as a great thing that some schools have done, and we did it in some ways, is how do you keep kids who are getting individual or getting IEPs who may get pulled from a classroom still engaged in the lessons, right? And so having technology that allow you to be able to utilize tools or utilize the classroom learning, even when a student may have to be pulled out for particular reasons or pulled out at particular times. And so if we're doing a bunch of, updates to the buildings, and then we're also not doing things to make sure the buildings are up to date, then it also kind of feels like it's not fully a true facilities master plan, right? Or like if we're redoing a playground, if we're not thinking about the accessibility of the playground, that's another factor that we should be making sure of as any of those things we do.
The one thing that we sometimes miss, like as an overall overreaching lens of the district, is technology just doesn't happen from like the computer, the device and standpoint. The technology of Windows over the past 15 years is monumental. The insulation is monumental. The even mulch has changed. You look at roofs, you look at different structures within the district. Almost everything that we touch has moved significantly from a technology standpoint. Paint, for example, has changed significantly in 15 years. So we get a lot of benefits, to your point, on the changes that we're going to make. We get some incremental benefits just by doing it because the technology has changed significantly in almost every one of those areas.
Yeah. And again, like we had the conversation about solar panels last year. And, one of the things we talked about was, well, you can't put a solar panel on a roof that's not steady enough to support the solar panel, right? So like, as we're thinking about those things are things that absolutely be part of the future conversation. Thank you, Mr. Burkhart.
Thank you.
Oh, yes,
Sorry,
sorry.
just one last comment. The conversation around catastrophic things that happen to the buildings, we do carry liability insurance, but we have a pretty high deductible. It's about $500,000. So it's, not all of it would have to come out of our operating funds.
One, and we know the true cost of some of those things also come from the speed at which we have to do it. Right. So like we remember having to have something fixed like within a couple weeks, get the students back into class. Yeah.
So Rothenberg, when there was a flood in the building, it was 18 days from the time the flood happened to the time the students were back in the building. That is monumental when you look at all the work that was done. When a car went through the lobby of Rising Stars at Vine on a Sunday morning in the 4 o'clock in the, what's that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we were open for business the next day. And so those are the types of things that I have to applaud our facilities team for the
Absolutely.
work that they do every day. Because that doesn't happen by happenstance. That doesn't happen when you have 6 feet of water in the basement of a building, and able to turn that around in 18 days. That was really monumental.
And again, that goes to both the work that has to be done, but also the preparation that we have to be prepared to, address those things in a timely manner. Because some districts aren't in a position where they could be able to handle those things in a timely manner.
Well, and kudos to the board because they actually granted me a $1 million authority so I could quickly give them funds rather than having to wait for 2 weeks for a board meeting.
Yeah.
So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Burkhardt. We are going to move to our monthly financial reports and turn it over to Treasurer Wagner and the team.
I'm turning it over to Kevin.
So, I think we can go through these pretty quickly. The key thing I would say for this month is there probably weren't any real surprises for October. So we'll take that. Next slide. This is the, let's see which one are we on? Sorry, I skipped ahead too far, Rob. That's the right one. Sorry. You'll see general fund is about 137 million of the 269 million, so about half of that. And then what we have building up to make our debt payments for sinking funds over the years. One of those I think comes due in the next year. It's about $3 million. So you'll see that go out at that point. The other one we usually point out here, state and federal grants, is in the negative because we're paying those things ahead of time and waiting on reimbursement.
Kevin, if I may, the report we debuted last month, the fund activity reports, is linked at the bottom of the slide. So we don't have to go over it, but obviously it's in your packet, and if you have questions, we're happy to answer those.
Okay. Next slide shows cash balance and encumbrances for the general fund. You can see it's up a little bit over last year. Cash balance, the 25 versus 24. Encumbrances are relatively the same, a little bit less at that point. The next slide shows 3-year history of cash balance in the general fund. So you can kind of see where we've reduced our cash a little bit over the course of the 3.5 years, but we're about where we were last year for general fund. Next slide. This is just the revenue slide. The third column being the current year and the fourth column being the budget. You can see our revenues overall are up a little bit. It's primarily related to property taxes, as we talked about before. State revenue is a little bit down. Some of that's timing. We'll cover that a little bit more when we talk about the forecast as well. Next slide is revenue by month. Again, as I mentioned, we see those property tax receipts primarily in July and January, maybe February, depending on if they get delayed. And then we had the tax anticipation notes last year, which kind of shifted that from one month to another. Next slide is 3-year expenditures by type. You can see again, the third column, our expenditures are up a little bit, primarily related to salaries and benefits. And as I mentioned last month, the 3-pay month has already happened, so that's fairly consistent just with COLA and step increases. Next slide is expenditures by month. Again, you can see the 3-pay months are usually the peaks that we see there. Otherwise, we're pretty well on track with that. Next slide, actually, I was going to take this one out. This is the one where we're just showing the accumulated. I took it out for the revenue, forgot to take it out for expenditures. But next slide is unencumbered or unallocated for general fund. Again, no real surprises. The green being the light green being what's basically reserved for salaries and benefits to be paid. The light blue being the actual expenditures, and the dark blue being encumbrances. And so we're at about 6%. That is just it's appropriated but not encumbered at this point. And some of it doesn't get encumbered because it's for service contracts that pay out directly, or they're charged out of the foundation or something of that nature. Next slide is one that Mike puts together.
And so this is a monthly statement of cash flow. Another decrease in cash, as we'll see, until we start getting real estate tax payments. Big things this month on the revenue side was getting TIF payment from the city of Cincinnati. And then on the expense side, our purchase services were up a little bit. Part of that was making the second United Way payment for CPP, and then also some technology leases paid. Next slide, Rob.
So the next section is the preschool expansion. This is actually a new graph that we had talked about last month, just to show at the end of the month, the report the CPS preschool gives to me shows that they had 1,915 students. So one of the things we talked about was what are the funding sources? And so these are the categories that they report in terms of number of students. So for instance, the first one is they receive early childhood education funding plus expansion dollars. So it's kind of a combined, and as Jen's mentioned before, first, like the levy is last dollar in.
Anywhere where you see the word expansion, that's general fund, that's for the $15 million set aside.
Excuse me. So like the third one is federal plus expansion. So they receive some funding through federal programs, Title I, for instance.
The way Vera does it is she'll do the AM session will be one funding source. The PM session will be this other funding source.
Yeah, a lot of that's the Title I Head Start split.
So we'll continue to present that, and we can actually show trending for that too, if that would be of interest. So that total is 1,915. I noticed on the next slide where I have the total number, I must not have updated that because I have 1,950. So that should actually be, I double checked, should be 1,915. Again, total all funding sources. Tuition assistance. As we talked about last month, some differences, the ECE grant funded seats were increased from 550 to 600. So 50 of the students are now getting services through that funding and not necessarily through tuition assistance. And then 120 seats are being part of the state full day pilot. And as I mentioned, levy dollars being first in, last out kind of thing. Next slide is basically just a budget recap of the CPS preschool expansion. As Mike mentioned, in that middle column of numbers, the 4.5 million is the total that we paid to United Way at this point, versus the budget will be 9.9. And then it compares to prior year as well. The next slide is again showing the tuition assistance with that same caveat regarding the seats, the changes in seats, but the dark blue is the current year. And then Mike for state and federal.
All right, next slide, Rob. So the graph again, bright colors are current year. We are ahead of schedule for the last couple of years, so that is a good thing. Kudos to the grants team. If you go to the next slide, you can see it in the grid. We are cranking through spending money, right? So it is a good thing. This is month 4 of the 15 cycle. So, you hope to be at 23, we're well in the 30s. So that's a good sign. Both for our public and our non-public. So we're helping out the non-publics to spend their money as well. So next slide, Rob. So just a reminder, one more, please. Just a reminder, here are our allocations for this year. We haven't officially gotten carryover yet, so this is what you're seeing, but just a reminder that a good chunk of the money does go to support non-publics, and we act kind of as the fiscal agent for that. If you go to the next slide, Rob, back one, please. Sorry, you're one slide, we're off that slide. So this is the entitlement grants in summary. So this is your title funds for the most part. You can see we're spending away, especially like Title IV, Title III. So everything looks good there as well. Next slide, Rob. Go ahead.
So the estimated carryover, we already have budgets. So as soon as they drop the money, we can start spending. It's usually such a long period.
Yeah. We also are working on early carryover. So there's a way to get it earlier. Traditionally, if you've done these, we usually talk about carryover in February, March time. But we're trying to get access to it earlier. So that'll help us. That'll help us in a lot of ways. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, next slide, Rob, is the ESSER blocks. As you can see, the ESSER blocks are almost the same now. It's just as expected. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the grid. ESSER is at this point basically done. There are some POs that have to pay out. And there's a couple journal entries we have to do. And we will bid ESSER a fond farewell. So. All right.
So let's pause there and just go back to see if there are any questions or thoughts, board members. I will, again, because I feel like it's the obligation of sitting in Eve's old seat that you have to, no one else asks a question. But I do want to point out a couple of things with regards to stuff you presented this week, this month. One is that preschool number is something that we really do need to be paying attention to the expectations going forward, because I think some of these things like the pilot program and some of these other things, we have to also think about whether or not those are long-term going to be around. Because if they're not, then those students come back into that tuition number. And so I think that's something for us to be thinking about as we look to that levy that needs to be put on the books as to what's the right number of students that would be covered for tuition and those other things that we pay for through the preschool expansion portion of that levy. So I think that's just something I'm kind of curious of, and maybe something we talk with our our legislative support folks about is what are the potentials of some of these things that are pilots sticking around. The other concern I have with that is that if something is a pilot that doesn't stick around and that changes how somebody utilizes the services, right? I'm more likely to bring my kid in for a full day if it's going to be paid for and I don't have to worry about it. And then if it becomes something where it might be a cost to me, my behavior might change. So that's just, one of those things that's kind of reality to that. The other thing, and I think we will talk about it maybe a little later, but the cash balance levels, I think that's another thing for us to be also mindful of as we hit to next month. Because, any delays and that type of things I do think make a difference into how we actually think about our spending habits and that kind of deal. And I know you've, Treasurer, I know you've brought this up to us before about wanting to set a floor at some point to what we must maintain. And I think that's just part of that conversation point.
Yeah, I have a chart that talk about that a little bit later.
But otherwise, I think, again, it's always helpful to see this information. I'm glad to see you're polishing up and finishing ESSER off. That's one less chart that at some point we will have to see. But thank you for getting us through those parts. Any other points you would like to make, at least on that part of the monthly updates? No? Good deal. All right. Well, let's keep it moving.
All right. So we'll jump into vendor contract review if you want to go to the next slide, Rob. So just to preface, this is a continuation of what we did last Finance Committee and looking at the over $200,000 RFP combination contracts. So not individual contracts exceeding 200,000, but if there's a combination of RFP contracts that exceed that amount, we wanted to review those. So I have some wonderful folks here with me that'll do most of the talking. I'll just facilitate here, starting with athletics. Just some things to point out here in the few contracts we have here. This is just an example. On the slides, there's just one example per group, and then we'll have the FY25 working vendor file at the bottom there where we're adding all the contracts that we review each meeting and updating that file. So to start with athletics, Mr. Harden is here. So there's about $3 million in contracts that we looked at. Most of these, actually all of these, were part of the RFP for athletic trainers. And something really cool to point out, especially with all three of these groups, they had 100% of their vendors that they use identify as either locally owned, minority owned, or a collaboration or combination of a few of those. So just to show that our teams are doing their due diligence and working for that. Yeah, celebrate that. Yes, Miss. So Rob, if you want to click on that working file, might ask you to toggle back a couple times. I apologize. And so if we want to, should be on the athletics tab. And here, I'll just let Mr. Josh talk about the contract himself. We're not going to go line by line, but we're just going to talk high level of why we have these contracts, the efforts that their team went through in building their KPIs and collecting their KPI data to ensure that the vendor is performing up to the standards that we expect, and just how we're keeping that accountable. So I'll hand it over to Mr. Josh.
Appreciate that, Cody, and thanks for all the work that you did to prepare all of this. So I'll just speak on the few that I have here, which are, to Cody's point, predominantly the athletic trainers and then the activities beyond the classroom contract. So we have multiple vendors for athletic trainers, notable here, Cincinnati Children's Hospital, Tri-Health, and Walton Mobile. As we know, we've been working the past few years on hiring more athletic trainers for coverage at our schools. Really, as we look at the KPIs, really focused on having those athletic trainers and team doctor professionals there, most notably at our high-risk collision sporting events. So we know that are more frequent with concussions and sudden cardiac arrest, to have a medical professional there. Currently, Cincinnati Children's has a contract that we have with them, and they are looking to secure staffing, but have not been able to secure staffing. Tri-Health, currently the contract with them have secured an athletic trainer at one of our schools. And then Walton Mobile is the group that is the one that's minority owned, women owned, local owned, and small business that stepped up for us in the past couple of years when some of the hospitals were unable to secure staffing. And they have secured multiple athletic trainers and team doctors, which has been very supportive. We worked with our partners at Activities Beyond the Classroom to do surveys on the athletic training contracts to assess through our athletic directors coverage for the particular athletic training providers, as well as the quality of service. We also have with our vendors event tracking sheets to confirm what events we have athletic trainers at and covering. And then I sit down with in addition to Amy Randolph, I sit down with the leaders in each of these organizations between Walton Mobile, TriHealth, and Cincinnati Children's. Also not included here, but since we're having the conversation, Mercy Health is another athletic training provider that supports us through a partnership with FCC, TQL, and Taft High School. Lastly, activities beyond the classroom. This is our longstanding contract with ABC to support the oversight of the athletic directors that we have within the district. That's another local-owned organization that has been a longstanding partnership between ABC and CPS Athletics, which is a larger contract, as I said, to support the athletic directors. This is year 5 of a 5-year agreement with ABC. And we know that the discussions are happening internally at Activities Beyond the Classroom, as well as Cincinnati Public Schools, and deeper conversations that are happening due to larger conversations on foundation that has come up with the board. And of course, on standby for phase 2 of the growth plan, which we know could impact junior high schools, which would ultimately impact the staffing that we have to oversee athletics throughout the district.
Thank you, Josh. All right. Any questions for Josh before we move on to student dining?
Here's none.
All right. So we'll move on to student dining. Yep. Thank you, Rob. Already ahead of me. Get my screen in. So with student dining, we had about $15.5 million in contract values. All the contracts will once again be listed on the working folder that we'll click on here in a second. But also just another highlight, 100% of the vendors that Ms. Shelley and her team uses are locally owned, minority owned, or a combination of those small business, women owned, that kind of group. So just want another shout out there. And then,
Non-general, so they're all in Fund 6.
yes, ma'am. Thank you, Jen. All right. And then Rob, if you want to click on the working folder, and I'll hand it over to Ms. Shelley.
Thanks so much. Hopefully I will go pretty quick here. We're going to have a busy spring with doing lots of RFPs because a lot of our contracts are up for RFP this year. So our first one is with Atlantic Food Group. They're actually one of our broadline distributors that brings in a lot of our shelf stable, frozen, boxed cans, and also uses some of our USDA food commodity brokerage money as well. We have a great relationship with this vendor. We're looking forward to expanding this broadline vendor contract, and we will be doing an RFP for next year because our 3 years is up. Next up is our DFA, our dairy brands. This provides our milk, which is a required component under the USDA regulations for school lunch program and also for school breakfast program. We are proud of this contract. We actually work very closely with them to ensure that they are purchasing their milk from Ohio farmers. Small farmers is our priority. It's considered to be a level 3 in the farming terms. 90% of our milk actually comes in from Ohio farmers through DFA. But we will be going out for an RFP for that as we are at the end of our 3-year contract with them. Creation Gardens provides all of our fresh produce to our schools through both our meal programs and also through our fresh fruit and vegetable program grant that we receive every year from USDA for our elementary schools. We will be going out again for RFP for this one as well, but we've been very happy with them. They've done a great job in helping us to source local farmers from Ohio. I think my mantra has always been that if I'm getting money from Washington, D.C., I'm going to keep it here as local as I possibly can. And we've achieved that by sourcing about 35 to 40% of our fresh produce from farms within a 250-mile range of CPS. Cisco Cincinnati is also another one of our broadline distributors where we get in our box, canned, shelf-stable, frozen, and also helps us with our USDA foods commodity dollar purchases. Again, we will be going out with an RFP for them as well for this coming year. Classroom and Bakery Company, we will actually be evaluating for an RFP, but we have signed on to be part of the Unified Purchasing Cooperative here in Cincinnati. And we found that we actually got a better pricing by being part of this co-op group than we did being separate standalone RFP. So we do plan on probably doing an RFP to make sure that we are getting the best price for our fresh bread items, but we will also be comparing that with what the pricing is with the Unified Purchasing Co-op as well. Cisco Cincinnati is listed again here because we actually had a paper goods bid that they won. But our paper goods is actually going to be moving under Stigler, who we're about to talk about on our next line here. They actually are a paper good company as well. And we've been purchasing from both of them because they didn't provide everything we needed and we're looking for in terms of recyclables and biodegradable products offering into our schools. But now Stigler has brought on that additional line of products. So we're able to streamline it as one vendor. And Stigler is also part of the Unified Purchasing Cooperative. So we are hoping to be able to piggyback again on that lower pricing that we receive from them versus going out again on our own with an RFP. But we still want to make sure that we are getting that best pricing. So we will be doing a separate RFP and then comparing that to what Unified Purchasing Co-op is able to offer us if we go with them. So that is where we are. Any questions?
Can I add a comment?
Yes.
Kudos to Jessica, because what I hear throughout the state is that most big districts that have to subsidize their student dining services, but they are completely independent of the general fund. So awesome.
Dr. Matt?
So I will again give you a kudos. I talked about our dining services at OSBA this past week when I was enjoying Aramark's food because it was good, but I enjoyed their food. And then I said, you know, we do this really, really well already. And he says, I've heard about Cincinnati Public. So kudos to you because you are known across the state as doing great work. So I want to make sure that gets known and bring that message back. Their food was good, but ours is better. And I got a chance to see the milk vendors. They were passing out their chocolate milk. And I said, oh, I've already tasted it. Thank you. We have that at Cincinnati Public as well. So with regards from the students, my question now is that we hear from the students around green sustainability, wanting to recycle, wanting to do things of that nature. How are we moving forward, incorporating any of their voice and concerns around, they have a lot of concerns, sustainability, food recycling and things like that. How are we doing that at the school level to kind of meet some of their needs?
Yeah. And that's an important part of our paper good bid as well. We're making sure that everything in our paper goods is recyclable or biodegradable. We have gone away from things like straws are now eliminated from our school campuses. We also have at our high schools this year, we rolled out utensil machines that pull out and also napkins that you pull down instead of getting a plastic pack at lunchtime. And those are actually coming out into our elementary schools. As hopefully by January, we'll have them rolled out into all of our elementary schools. It is a difficult situation because when we do have separation of a compost, recycle, landfill, the kids still don't necessarily utilize that benefit and resource to put the items in the different categories. So it's something that we would love to work with, but unfortunately not a lot of schools, when we do put that option out there, actually utilize it.
That I have to say, as a grown person who's over 50, I don't always utilize it as efficiently as I should too. And I get to the garbage can, I'm like, okay, wait a minute, is this a landfill thing? So to the administration, what are we doing to honor the concerns of the students around sustainability and wanting to be efficient? Because there's a lot of schools that come and write letters to us and say, hey, we need to do this differently. Are we teaching that in the curriculum? Like, are some schools doing, some schools have recycle clubs. So what are we doing to make sure, or at least to kind of make it full circle, that they're getting the information and then we're actually doing this so that there may be a cost savings or at least, you know, some sort of savings eventually?
That's a great point. I know when I was last at Woodward, there was a recycle team. So I'll follow up to see to what extent that's happening in our schools now.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
There's one other little tiny caveat that is challenging in Cincinnati, and that is that there's not a lot of availability to utilize compost
Oh, okay.
within our city. There used to be the worm man who was located, Chris is laughing because remember there was a person located in Loveland, Ohio, who had a business where he would actually come around to different organizations and schools and collect the compost to bring up and then create it in an ability to compost it in a way that was then able to be pushed back out into the schools to use for their school gardens or
Mhm.
their other agricultural initiatives. They're no longer in business and haven't been in business for over a decade now.
Oh, wow.
Composting within the city limits can be very challenging because if you have a compost bin that's not properly turned over or cared for, you could actually create a vermin situation around the area. So we want to be very cautious about how we utilize that. And if there is a club that's willing to take that on, then they have to be truly dedicated to
Dedicated to
making
it.
sure that that happens, or else I create a bigger problem for facilities.
Sure, I guess. And I'm just, yeah, we don't want the vermin and then we don't,
I mean, I don't know how to say it, but I mean, that's
No, you're
that's
right.
always a step hill challenge. Recycling is one of those things that we work hand in hand with our custodian team to make sure, especially in our kitchen areas, that we are breaking down those cardboard boxes.
Yeah.
We're rinsing out those number 10 cans and we're taking initiatives to make sure that the larger items that we can have control over are being recycled from our kitchen areas.
Mhm.
The cafeteria area is challenging to get the kids to recycle and landfill differently. When we did have the superintendent student leadership team who come in here, we had several conversations about how we could set this up for them and would it be useful? And they were all like, no, we won't use it. So I would love to be able to put something into schools, but I would be concerned that it wouldn't be utilized in the way that we were hoping it would be.
Well, thank you for that. I'm actually really excited to see the number of schools that have recycle teams, or because I know that I spoke to the Walnut one, Withrow had one and Woodward has one. So those are 3 right now. And so I think that maybe if we had a more formalized process, that might help too, because if to leave it to them, that may not be helpful. But I would love to see if we could make it where they're getting the learning and then they can maybe utilize some of that with our so we've got schools that are agriculture focused. We've got rooftop gardens at Rothenberg. We've got schools that are doing great things that maybe we could make that a little bit more with intentionality, make it a little bit more efficient. So thank you for the work that you're doing now. Yeah.
Julia Ducas's and one thing I want to add on to, and I think is an important part for us to talk about when we talk about food and dining, is food education. And so I wonder if there's any element of adding that particular part to a KPI. Are some of our vendors willing to provide some educational elements to what's a good, where do they get where are they getting the milk from? Like how are these things that are all part of what are people putting in their bodies? Because I do think that is another aspect of having local vendors, having some of the different programs that we do, like 4-H and these other things that are happening throughout. These are great opportunities to connect them with the students directly as a KPI potential measure that doesn't cost the business a lot. And I don't know if that's something that's being done at all, or
We could definitely look into that. I know that Creation Gardens helped us with our farmers trading cards that were incredibly popular for our elementary kiddos. Those were a lot of fun where we actually featured the different farmers on one side and then where all the crops were grown and information about them on the opposite side. And we had talked to American Dairy Mideast about possibly doing that also for our milk program and our Ohio farmers. So we can definitely look into what the different things are. We do have on all of our serving lines information about the product itself and any allergens and different information for the kiddos. And then of course our online menus have all the information too about caloric and how to build a healthy plate. So we can definitely talk to these vendors. The issue is that, for example, my broadline distributor like Cisco is bringing in products that from manufacturers. So I think maybe what I need to do is take that back to our manufacturers to see what they can provide for us as a benefit to highlight the items.
and even, again, even experiences with like the dairy is a great example of one that could talk about what happens to get milk from here to there, right? Like some of that is just more of a an opportunity to educate our kids on something that they may not normally experience. Julie, do you have a really quick question?
Do they still have the recycling dumpsters by demand if they need it? So I know that that was a problem for a while, that some of the schools, they were saying they didn't have enough space or there was a cost involved. How is that working now with the dumpster that is for recycling?
So-
You stuck around, Chris?
So that's, and I don't want to get too deep because we can have a whole conversation about recycling at this point. But that's ebbed and flowed over the years. So, let's go back to a decade ago. There was a need for recycled because what Rumpke and some of the other folks were doing was taking that recycling and selling it to suppliers who wanted that recycling. That has gone by the wayside now. So a lot of those folks who wanted the recycled goods previously do not want them now. So really it's to a point where it's costing us to put that recycling in place because there isn't that revenue generation stream that it was previously. There's still a need for cardboard, clear glass, a lot of the plastics, not so much anymore, like it was, 5, 6, 7 years ago, especially pre-COVID. So that's something that's going to ebb and flow throughout our district as as the global climate changes in relation to recycling. So it's something that we're going to continue to either gravitate towards or back off on according to what the need is.
So if a school wants a recycling, then they contact you.
Correct. Or facilities. They would probably get it quicker through facilities, but they can contact me as well.
Cool. All right, we'll keep this going, Cody.
Thank you, sir. All right. Thank you, Miss Shelley. Going to pass it on to Mr. Martin here in just a second with transportation. Just a few things to highlight here. Roughly $28 million in contract value with almost 90% of their vendors still being locally owned, minority owned, or a combination. So just another highlight there that a great job from that team in using those locally owned vendors just to ensure that we're keeping business around. So I will hand it over to Mr. Martin and let Rob click on. Yep, sorry. I went too fast. Take it away, Mr. Martin.
Thank you much. I was looking at our first line here, line 2, that's our multi-vendor PO. We call it our White Fleet vendors, and they're used primarily to transport our babies as special accommodations, Project Connect, our IEP with the transportation related accommodations. On to the next line, this is a UTS. These are our dental vans, and this is a program initiative that we've been working on for over a year now, and we've had zero issues with this. Transportation has been great for our transporting students for this dental van initiative. For Peterman is our smallest yellow bus contractor. And we've had great work with them over the years. They've been a great partner for us. When it's a first student, they're our largest yellow bus contractor. And we've had a good ongoing relationship with first student as well. UTS is also another one of our yellow bus contractors. They're right in the middle between Peterman and first student, and we've had an ongoing good relationship with them. And UTS provides us some yellow bus services and White Fleet services. So UTS Westchester falls under that second line of the multi-vendor, and they're used primarily to move our students that have special needs accommodations or Project Connect. Hightower Petroleum is what we use to fuel our vehicles, and we've had a good ongoing relationship with them. And as of right now, I know we've been working currently, my senior account tech of my departments are working currently on a federal rebate for fuel. So we hope to see some money recouped here soon. This line just outlines some of our then and nows that we've had to work with over years past. And typically this comes up for us. So we get into the summer months, summer scholars. So we're still having routes running through summer scholars when it's time to close out the budgets. And we have some invoices that might come after the budgets are closed out, and we'll have to work through that at times. And SORTA, Metro, again, ongoing relationship with them has been positive, and we're still working through making sure we're streamlining all of our Metro Smart cards and our new Metro Smart Card extracurricular passes to make sure everything's aligned and students are accountable and all our funds there are being spent appropriately.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Real quick, I just wanted to highlight some of the things that maybe you could talk about a little bit for us. Using the use of the fleet schedule report on Versatrans and how it's helping us develop these KPIs, because the KPIs are really, really good. We're able to track like on-time percentages, number of miles traveled. So could you talk about that system a little bit and how we use that to develop these KPIs?
Is Versatrans is what we use for all of our routing. For all of our routing. So as students are registered through Focus and the information feeds in the Versatrans, so my routers can see it, transportation specialists can see it, and then route for the students to make sure we have the appropriate vehicle and drivers and look at the route and where they're living and in relation to their home of record to their campus. And we can go right into Versatrans and pull out those KPIs for on-time performance, making sure the students are transported to and from school in alignment with the bell schedule, and also with our resources as far as buses, vans, cars, and resources we have available to us and how we're using that as best possible.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. And that is all that we have for the vendor contracts. Does anybody have any questions for transportation at this time?
All right. Oh, sorry.
It's not a question. I just wanted to say, I had the same thought about the food contracts. I just wanted to say how nice it is to see the KPI work come this far along. You know, I was on the finance committee in my first year on the school board, which was also when COVID started. So we had other things we were talking about, but this was like I think like a picture of where we wanted to be some years down the road. And so it's nice to see a lot of leadership and effort and emerging rigor around all of this. And there's more that we can do. There's always more we can do. But it's nice to have some of these things in place.
Thank you, sir. And I just want to say thank you to Ms. Shelley, Mr. Harden, and Mr. Martin for showing up today and collaborating with me and their teams. It's a very collaborative effort, ongoing conversations, just great work. And I'd like to see where we're going, and we'll have some more updates in the future. Thank you.
And so next should be the, do we want to do the policy first, or do we want to go to, this is, I think, should actually the next slide on there.
Start the next slide. Okay. So, we don't have a policy that dictates or gives me the authority to write off what we call bad debts. So a debt is created when a former employee leaves the district, owes the district money back. Like, for example, they were a no-show returning from summer and nobody reported them not coming back soon enough. They started getting paid for the year and I'm required to get that money back. So we start contacting them, send them an invoice, and then it escalates after so many days. We send them a more threatening letter, send them to third-party collection. And at some point we have several on the books now that have declared bankruptcy. So they're just uncollectible. And I'm not allowed to write them off unless I have authority to do so that's given by the board. So we drafted up, Mike and I and the AR team drafted up something for you to look at, just introducing the idea, and then we can walk through it with feedback next time. Anything to that?
No, it's a great summary.
And again, the typical thing we've done in the past is that this comes before budget, finance, and growth to talk about kind of the budget connections to this, then goes to policy to have policy review it. And then sometimes we do a couple times of a loops back and forth, but essentially it would then go to the board for discussion and or votes to approve it. And then this is strictly on those things that are at this point uncollectible balances. And I think it says some of these are pretty low balances as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Dr. Moffitt.
So I'm all for establishing a policy, especially if one is needed. I would like to understand how we get here. If a person doesn't come to work, how are they getting paid? And I'm not talking about them reporting it because I wouldn't expect them to, but how are they still in the system when they're not there?
It's a great question, and that we've tightened up those processes with the our partners in HR. But if the school doesn't tell HR that this person didn't return, then they're on contract, so they're on salary, so that they just pay until we hear different. Until somebody puts them in inactive, we're going to pay our employees. So
I get it. I think this feels like we're still permitting lack of accountability at the school level.
I think
So what I'm wanting to know is yes to you in this, but I'm going over to my left, like this has to be tightened up on some level, because can you tell me what the balance is of unpaid funds that we're trying to recollect?
off the top of my head, I don't remember. We'll bring it to you.
Okay, I would love to see that, because that's a liability for us that we are having to recover. So just from an economic standpoint, if it's, and I'm assuming it's probably more than $10,000. So let's say it's like $100,000. Well, that's great. But if it's more than $1, that's a lot of money. So we need to tighten that ship up.
so. My immediate thought is every year we have an opening school checklist that we go over with principals to make sure we're ready to go for school year. So adding this, if it's not already there, could be the best way to make sure we don't have that gap.
We did put new things in place so that employees are required to sign. So we send out, here's your staffing report, and we have everybody sign in on the first day or two of when they report. And that's helped us catch those things. But some of these that we're talking about right now happened prior to that new process.
So a question that just kind of comes up in my mind is that's done if something is done at the beginning of the year, what's done quarterly to catch that? Can we put some nets in place so that they're not being paid? And what would be the average time period that these people are getting paid that we're having to recover? All those are questions that you can come back and answer. But my point is, if it's going like up to 6 months, then something needs to be put in place before the 6-month period, if that's the average. So those are just questions I'll ask later. But okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And again, this
Thank
is
you.
part of the partnership. I think we've had these discussions in the audit committee as well, as to what are the procedures in place to ensure accuracy of information being put in. I think we've seen this before with benefits even, or access to buildings, or whatever the case may be, where we're wanting to make sure we have systems in place that then we can identify where the hole in the system occurred. And so if the hole is that you have someone in the building who did not update as someone leaves, and that's something we can hold that person and hold that part of the process accountable. I think it was a lot harder in the past where multiple people are trying to figure out there may be multiple holes you're trying to figure out.
There's another phenomena that's occurring that causes us to overpay or to pay people and then they owe us money back, is when a salaried employee starts the year with us and then they leave mid-year. Because we're on a 26 pay cycle every year and we have 365 days, every year that first paycheck, they're getting paid before they work, right? So this year it was 11 days. We were prepaid before somebody actually earned the money. So if they leave in December, they owe us 11 days of pay because they haven't worked and you don't catch up until the end of the year. So it's always very hard for people to understand. If they resign mid-year, they usually owe the district money back. And so that's another challenge that we just have to capture when we know about recent resignations.
Just to follow up to that, are we letting them know that in the beginning at their hiring? I think, are we doing that? Because that would be fair to me to say, hey, this is how the pay cycle is, so that we can check off the box to say you knew it.
That's a good question. We'll talk to the welcoming packet, the employee packet, and see if we can put something in there. But we also made a recommendation last year to change from a 26 pay cycle to a 24 pay cycle to pay twice a month. But we need that is a negotiating item, so we have to talk with our union partners.
I think the other parts of this, though, again, for where these things come up, is this is solely after someone's gone through after we've gone through multiple efforts to collect. And so I do think there is an aspect of this that is, we get a portion of that back usually through one of those efforts beforehand. What we are now talking about is those folks who we've done and actually probably spent more than some cases this is actually worth to keep pursuing to get funds from folks. And now I think the policy that we're being asked to consider is a policy to, essentially not continue spending money to gather something that we're not likely to get.
Exactly. And we are employee friendly, so that we're not saying, give us all the money back in one lump sum.
Yeah.
We let them go into a payment plan. So you can say something.
I was just gonna say, a lot of these, are at the point where the next step would be to file, you know, a small claims action in court, but you know, there's filing fees, there's legal fees, and like you said, at some point, you know, it's not worth, the cost of collection doesn't equal the amount owed.
Someone owes you $250. Didn't make a whole lot of sense to
Right.
keep
But-
going along the path
The
there.
operative state doesn't care, they want the money back, so, we just need a tool to help us clean that up.
Absolutely. All right. Then I think the next thing on the agenda is the QI team.
Sure. Give Rob a second. So this month's QI team is about reducing requisition rejections. That's gonna be hard for me to say. So for those of you who, right, it's a tongue twister. So for those of you who follow along, you remember that for any time we spend money, we have to have a PO in place ahead of time before that money's spent. How you get from an idea or a need to that purchase order is what's called the requisition process. Right, and so you know, we have a group of people looking at how often, and there's a workflow behind it, these things get rejected for various reasons. Next slide, Rob. Don't mind. So Lisa Bryant is the leader of this group. She's our manager of budget and accounting. She's out today. It was my bad because I forgot to ask her until like Tuesday. She's like, wait a second. But she's doing a great job. This committee's been around for a while. We're kind of refreshing it. People come, people go. We try to increase our kind of school and central office representation on these teams. You know, so it's not just all the treasurer's office telling people how things should be, but we want to get that feedback and make sure we have a broad team. If you go to the next slide, Rob. This is kind of our key driver diagram. So our goal this year is to reduce our rejections from 23% to under 15. When we started this whole process, we were at about a third of every rec, about a third of all recs got rejected at least once. So we went from a third to a fourth, and now we're trying to go from a fourth down to about 15%. So big things that kind of this current group is looking at is at our training. So looking at the training we do, the training resources, you can see kind of the bold interventions there. Some of the things they're trying to make sure we train people up right from the start. To go to Jen, you want to say something?
Yeah,
You can
I'm
talk.
sorry. So this is actually a sub-project of a larger project. Was how many days does it take us to go from a request to a purchase order? Like, how can we shorten that cycle to please our customers, which are our schools and central office? And so the rejected requisitions was a root cause of the delay, right? And so that now they're down to that fishbone diagram. Only once today so far. And so they're trying to solve that because this is the biggest root cause of why requisitions got delayed in the system.
Thank you. Next slide, Rob. So this is our run chart. You can see we got several years of data here. The red is current year, so we're trending right with last year. And obviously our goal is, What is that color? Is that like I guess that's a green. Sorry.
Green.
I'm sorry, that's a green. See, one of the problems is when you're
Sounds
red,
like
green,
blue.
colorblind. I literally am red, green colorblind. Yes.
Are you really?
Yes. Yes. Now that everyone knows. When they used to give me the little books, in elementary school, I'm like, I don't see any number there.
You can read positive and negative signs though, right?
I can't read positive.
We don't
numbers.
view it.
Exactly. Or parentheses. Yeah. Thank you. So the green is current year. We're trending kind of where we were. Goal obviously is to go below that. Don't look at June. June data is an outlier because when we cut off recs, and that's usually around May, the sample size is like 1 or 2 in June. So we don't really look at that data, but the chart looks weird without it. So we're excited to see what the team's going to do. If you go to the next slide, Rob.
My favorite.
We're just gonna sit here and bask in the fishbone. Treasurer Wagner's favorite diagram of all time.
They actually had a bet about how many times I would use that word in a year.
Are you winning?
I wasn't included in that.
Oh.
They didn't tell me until afterwards. They said they quit counting after 25.
It was kind of like the baby pool, but it was a
Funny.
fish. Yeah.
And then Josh bought me a t-shirt that says #fishbone.
Right. Josh has t-shirts. So But the fishbone diagram is a really cool tool for folks trying to figure out, the root cause of a problem. And so you take a set of data, this was about 2 weeks. And pull down the causes and try to categorize them and then also look at numbers. So interestingly, our current big fishbone, and if you go to the next slide, Rob, it's a Pareto chart that shows you the same thing, is actually with attachments, which you would think would be wouldn't be a big deal, but quotes that are expired, that aren't clear enough, that don't have all the information, that don't identify the vendor. And so that's something that we will be working on cleaning up. The other thing, obviously, we have to do is update the other. Anytime your other is the second highest number, then you need to do more fishboning, right? You need to add some more fishbone. So, but it's all good work. Next slide, if you don't mind. So just a couple kind of project sorry.
Yeah, we'll do it after. At the end. Yeah.
Okay. So just a couple key things. One thing for this team is the focus has changed over time, and that's big. As problems have been solved, they drop off. So like there were some really technical issues back in the day that were 50% of the problems, and we eliminated that and made the process simpler. Life got better. So we're just kind of focusing at one problem at a time. Again, having a wide breadth of team members is important. People who really actually do the process every day. So we're not telling people how they should do their job as much as we're learning their barriers and their experience. And then, like I said, the next steps for this team is going to be around training, and our training delivery model for our clerical staff. So I think I'll stop there for questions.
Mr. Lindy?
Thanks, Brennan. I'm genuinely not trying to step in the middle of something, but I just question about the fishbone. If we go back a couple slides.
Yeah, sure.
And this may have been explained in a prior meeting and I missed it too, but I'm familiar with the Pareto chart and I can follow the Pareto chart. Can you just explain like how this works, how it's related, how it's different from what, like I said, I'm not trying to earn gen points. I'm just genuinely interested.
Yeah, this is a good question. It's funny because we had this conversation actually with the Impact U coaches the other day, because it was the part in the class where they teach Paretos. And Paretos are simple. I like them. Fishbone is an alternate to that, and sometimes it also kind of ties in. Are you familiar with the 5 whys? Yeah. You're familiar with the 5 whys. So those two kind of tie together. But the idea is at the end of the day, you're going to get to the same thing. But what the fishbone allows you to do is kind of pull out the pieces of the category. So if you don't know what the categories are when you create the Pareto chart, because part of that creation work is categorizing your issues. So you have this kind of categories that you can use a fishbone to create those categories, right? So just going issue by issue. So on this one, here was the issue, create a fishbone. What category is that in? Next issue, what it is. And then when you roll it back up, kind of rolls back up to the Pareto chart.
And so am I right in thinking then that if you're creating a fishbone from scratch, you just have the horizontal line when you start, and you start then you start filling in the things that are not in the boxes. And then the last thing you have are the boxes. Is that the right order?
So the way it's actually a brainstorming tool. So you have a problem statement, and then you, in a team, you say, well, okay, why does this happen? That's your first why. So for every why, you build a bone off the spine, right?
And then why is that? Then you build another off the.
Nature, as problem solvers, we tend to focus in on what we think is the biggest why. When you have to gather the data to prove which one is the biggest why, you go after that one first.
Yeah.
And then there could be sub whys. So that's why there's the little bones off of each big bone.
I got it. Thank you.
For the, I know that the requisition is a huge, there's a lot of concerns with many teachers with the rejections. And I think that, they don't understand why they are limited to certain vendors that are way more expensive, and they can't just order it from like Amazon for half the cost. And so I think that if we look at the vendors, and if we could get some a larger array of vendors, then possibly teachers could get more for their money. That's what they always tell me.
So So this, what you're talking about is really managed under Chris, and the purchasing department reports to Chris for part. Who unfortunately has left the building, but, I've heard that before, and we'll certainly pass on that conversation. Part of the issue is because we do an RFP and a vendor wins the RFP, they're entitled to get our business. And so those other vendors, didn't win the RFP, and so if we start buying from them, we could set ourselves up for legal action. They might be cheaper on one particular item, but as the global RFP, they go with the best vendor to serve the district. And so, I'll pass your comments on to Chris so that they can address it.
I have a question.
Dr. Moffett.
So along that line, I would like us to talk about that further because I'm wondering, that to me equates to how teachers go and spend their own money because they can save money. And so that's problematic to me. If a vendor is charging 250 and another one, I can get it for $100, that gives me more money to play with longer term. So is there a cost associated with the RFP so that we're using certain vendors for certain things up to a certain dollar amount? Like, well, how does that work? And then I think the other piece to that, just to give you all my thought, is that there needs to probably be more education to the teachers around what the limitations are if this is an issue. I don't know if that's on the fishbone or not, I can't see it, but maybe that needs to be a part of training that they're getting, that these products can only be with this particular vendor, but these products can go otherwise.
So we also have a lot of requirements to vet our vendors and pre-certify them. They have to go through the terrorist watch system and whether they're financially stable or whatnot before we're allowed to do business with them. So just because there's a vendor that has cheaper prices doesn't necessarily mean it's a vendor we're allowed to do business with. So like I said, we'll pass on that conversation and maybe we'll have Chris come back with Trina and who's a purchasing director, and then she can go into more details.
For the education piece,
Yeah.
you all or them?
Them.
Be purchasing.
Thank you.
And this is not I think at universities, you see this as well in other districts where, truly folks want to get things for the cheapest, and that's a great thing to do. The struggle becomes because we purchase so much of something or because we purchase certain things, if it's done in the wrong way, it also can create these additional liabilities and also create these additional problems. And so we want to make sure folks are educated on how to do it, but also that they're doing it early enough, which is something we've been talking about for the last couple of years.
Well, and also the funding source has
Yes.
some sources are much more restrictive in spending. Like, I remember in COVID, all the schools wanted to buy masks with their logos on them. Well, federal funds won't allow us to do that. You can't personalize stuff with federal funds, so. It's shocking, but yes. So, and they're getting stricter and stricter and stricter as they go, so. But yeah, we'll certainly invite Chris and Trina back.
Righty. Any other questions on this? I think I'll just add one thought to it real quick, and I appreciate us talking about removing the process of these rejections occurring or reducing why these occur. Again, I think some of this is also really getting into the why. It tells us what we need to do to fix. And I think that's one of the things, we've talked about here. We talked about an audit committee as well, of if we don't know what's the reasoning behind why these things are not working,
Right.
makes it really hard to go in and say, we're going to fix it in an efficient way.
So like one example, when we first started looking at the shipping was missing shipping charges or not enough shipping charges was the largest rejection. So what we did is we created a blanket order for shipping. And when a school either forgets it or it doesn't estimate enough of it, we use that blanket order so that it doesn't cause a failure. So we're using it to get better. Yes.
That's awesome. All righty.
Can we switch to the forecast?
Yes, I was going to say, we're going to skip to the forecast here.
I thought you were gonna skip me altogether.
Never could.
So a couple things in your packet. This is the larger format that Eve always likes. President Bolton always likes. So everything that I'm going to cover in the PowerPoint relates back to that. So it's just like one good visual for it, but we're kind of breaking it down and slicing it up in the PowerPoint. And then also the board members have a copy of the notes which will actually be approved as part of the treasurer's report as well. And it has a little bit more detail. It's actually about 25 pages. So we won't go through that, but it does have a lot of information in there that you can look at ahead of. So Monday night will be, it's required to be approved twice a year, the end of May, the end of November. And then it has to be submitted with the Department of Education and Workforce by the end of November. So that's why we want to make sure it gets approved on the last board meeting. Next slide. These first two slides just kind of give some background relating to the forecast, some considerations that we consider as part of it, and that maybe outside influences, maybe district management, things that have to take place in order to maintain a cash balance and not find ourselves in a negative situation. So just a couple things I'll highlight here. Legislative action. We've kind of talked about these, some of the things being floated out there. In Columbus, Senate Bill 308, possible elimination of the 20 mil floor. And I know Jen has touched on this quite a bit, but obviously would have a huge effect on the amount of state or tax revenue that we will receive at the district. So we certainly are hoping that other routes are done in that area. So the other one is, this one hasn't been talked about recently. It was really a big thing last year about changing the way counties do reappraisals. Currently they do the recent year of sales versus the 3 years of sales. So that what that would do is create the appraisals wouldn't go up as high. And so that topic may come up again. The other thing I'll say there, I think I said this before as well. While we did have an influx of tax revenue as a result of the reappraisal, there's a little bit of a lag that will have an offsetting effect on our state revenue. So you can't really look at everything in isolation. You have to take it all together. So I think those are some key points to consider. The Fair School Funding Plan, you know, there'll be another biennial budget coming up this July, hopefully. So the phase-ins that we've talked about in the past is still on the table. They're not in law yet. We anticipate every indication we're getting is that they probably will continue those. But that's something else that is kind of a wait and see. Obviously, as always, inflationary rates are something we have to consider. We don't really know, as Chris mentioned, in the building projects and those types of things will be affected by that as well. A big one here, which I wanted to highlight, was the district controlling spending levels. If you recall last year, there was a commitment that the board members each made at that time to maintain our expenditures within the estimated revenues levels. And I know there's been a big effort for that. And especially in the current budget, I think that was a big consideration. And why it was maybe so hard to get to that point. There are some things in this current budget that will eat into our cash, or we anticipate will eat into the cash, but those were more directed. And I think, you know, if we can stick to that plan, I think will be beneficial for us. Kind of mentioned again, the ESSER cliff. We're going to stop talking about that soon, but it definitely affected our 25 budget because there were a lot of items that were able to be paid out of 507 that this year had to come into 001, which made the budget challenge obviously much more difficult this year. Another thing that impacts the forecast is student enrollment projections and actual enrollment. We don't have a crystal ball. So we, you know, are basically, the other thing that's causing some challenges there is the state funding. There's a little bit of a lag in getting all of the students updated, and there's a new system this year. So there are some students that at this moment we're not getting funded for because of some issue within the reporting. And so I know the EMIS Performance and Accountability Department is really working on getting those all cleaned up. And so that will hopefully help around the edges in terms of the budget. And then obviously collective bargaining agreements with all the agreements coming up again this year will impact where our finances are in the next year, next 5 years. So next slide is, again, I think I've already covered these things in terms of increased property tax revenue, changes to state funding. DPIA is another factor that has changed amongst all the districts. I also mentioned in the Just Ask Jen, if you look at public funding for schools this year has actually gone down. All districts across the state, the total funding has gone down, which doesn't really make sense when you consider the phase-ins and such. But and for urbans, it actually went down more than for non-urbans. So anyway, just to kind of give you some lay of the land of things that we're keeping our eye on and will ultimately impact state funding. The next slide is kind of a summary of this big page right here. But the key thing I want to point out here, so that the yellow highlights, those are the points that ODEW looks at to determine if a district is having fiscal distress. In particular, that year 3, which is we have a renewal levy up that will impact that. But they're looking at that point. If you're in a negative at that point, they will most likely either one, they'll ask you to remediate it. Do you have a way to remediate it? Or they will potentially put you in a fiscal watch situation or fiscal emergency. One of the assumptions in the forecast, again, is we're going to keep expenditures within our revenues. So we are anticipating having a $40 million, $41 million cash balance at that point. We did do an alternative forecast, assuming we just kind of let everything grow the way it normally would. And unfortunately, because our revenues wouldn't grow at the same trajectory, we potentially could be in a fiscal issue at year 3.
So what Kevin's trying to say is if we don't keep our budget at the revenue level, we're going to be in a cash deficit in fiscal year 27.
So next slide, just to kind of show the summary of the base costs, and we've talked about this previously as well. So the state funding formula uses all of the data. They estimate an average teacher cost, custodial costs, all of those costs. And basically they determine that the cost to educated pupil is $8,100. We as a district spend more than that. But then they apply those wealth factors that then say that because we could go to the voters and levy more money based on those appraisal values, they determine our local share is $5,103. So the state's portion that we receive through the foundation payments is only about 37% of that total. Next slide, talk a little bit about enrollment. The years obviously through 24, fiscal year 24 are actual. So that's funded enrollment, which is a little different than actual kids in seats. But those are actuals through 24. The 25, we've taken into account some of the changes. ODE is using a number. We have a number. We still have a projected number. So we're kind of using an estimate there. And based on those recent trends, we're projecting out a little bit of a drop in enrollment for this purpose to determine, which I think is a conservative approach for this purpose. Man, everybody's leaving me. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
So Kevin, that drop in enrollment is valued at what in the state formula?
I'm sorry?
The drop in enrollment is valued at what in the state formula? About $6 million, right? A reduction?
Yes,
Yes,
a
for this
net,
year.
yes. Yeah, I think once we updated it with some of the recent data, it got us to that point. There are still some fatal what they refer to as fatal errors within the system that we're not currently getting funded for, that's the term they use. In other words, they're telling us you're not getting funded for this student for one reason or another. And it seems like from just looking at how things are going, you know, maybe a quarter of those turn into a full-time funded child within the formula. But again, that's a process. And I know with the new system and the beginning of the year, that's kind of created some challenges there. I'm just going to highlight the next slide is, I think I skipped ahead. I sure did. Okay. Revenue. So this is one of the graphics that the software we utilize pulls out, which I think is very meaningful for 25. You can see 58% of our revenue is related to local taxes. And it kind of gives you a breakdown of that. The blue being the state sources, 29%, and then all other is 13%, which is primarily TIF, CRAs, some Medicaid reimbursement, and that type of thing. The next slide is revenue overview. The reason 24 was high was due to the tax anticipation note. The tax anticipation note that was issued. And then the orange, I believe it's orange, on the last three is the renewal levy, a half year in FY 27, a full year in 28, and a full year in 29. That if that was to not be renewed or put back, that would be a loss in revenue. I'm going to skip over the next few slides. There's one about taxes, public utility. Next one, state aid, unrestricted, restricted, and then all other, as I mentioned, is TIF and CRA primarily. The next slide is the same thing for expenditures. So you can see our personnel costs. Salaries and benefits represent about 73% of our total budget. 19% purchase services, and then everything else in the yellow category. Next slide. Oh,
I'm sorry, purchase services would include all our transportation, processing, utilities, supplies, all of our contracted services for trash, electricity.
So the next slide is just an expenditure overview. Again, you see the bump in 24 for repaying the tax anticipation notes. Otherwise, you can see what we projected based on the caveat that we would maintain the budget within the revenue totals. Say that again. Next slide is personal services. The only thing I want to point out on the next series of slides, the reason 22 was so low is because school-wide pool was showing as a transfer out of the general fund. And so you didn't have the separation of salaries, benefits, purchase services, et cetera.
You can see the difference on page 19 or slide 19, where 22 had a huge.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. So then the remaining other financing uses is primarily debt service transfers and transfers to the classroom facilities that we're required to do as part of the master plan, which is a little over $3 million a year. Next slide, Rob. This is the forecast summary. Again, you can see the cash balance line assumes that after this year, we maintain the cash balance. Again, there's an alternative forecast that has an alternative view of this, which would have in the last year, negative 73 million. At that point would be our cash balance. Next slide. This is a graphic that it calculates the estimated number of calendar days of cash on hand. And we're going to talk a little bit about cash policy, I know, probably at the next meeting. But just to show as how that can be affected going forward the five years. And then the next section is a graph that I think Jen's going to touch on. It's after that.
You can just flip to the next slide. Okay. So I know this is kind of hard to read, but what I'm trying to do is show, but based on after our forecast, what are these additional projects gonna cost and how, and what size millage will we need? So after the forecast, when you look into the non-colored line, so we have I put in here that, if we went with a $40 million, maintained our $40 million cash balance, how much money will we need to do that moving forward? Having said that, in the notes, you're gonna see where they recommend a 60-day cash balance. We'd have to set aside $150 million to do that, to get our 60 days, given our current budget. So it might be something that we step up to as we move forward. But you'll see Monday night, the thing about the growth plan. So I put estimates, I have it linked to the growth plan. So the first year it's a net savings, and then we have some recurring costs going forward. The next one is the facility repair plan that you saw earlier today. And that's linked as well. So then we have growth plan 3, which is the new building construction, the $200 million that people were talking about. I've separated them because they're different phases. Even if we did a levy today and for a bond levy or a PI levy, we wouldn't get the money until 28. So I moved the money there, but we may have to delay it until the old bond levy expires and we put a new one in. So those are conversations that we need to have. Then I put in a line for technology because we used $6.5 million this year of ESSER money to pay for the technology leases. So Jeremy gave me the 5-year lease plan. And so this line shows you, some of it's already in the general fund. So I'm showing you just the incremental cost that's needed. And then I tried to do the same thing with the curriculum line. Adam and I are working on the same thing. How much is already in the general fund? What's incremental? Because like next year, the ELA comes up for a new adoption and it's going to cost X amount more. So what's that delta? So that will update that line as it goes. So this is clearly overstated at this point. As we were meeting this morning, I've actually added 2 more lines to this, and that's the crossing guards. And if we do the custodial expansion that Chris is asking for, so just putting in as placeholders. So then you can see, and the blue line show you the millage. So one of the millage is just with everything that's there. The one on the bottom is without that $200 million. Or I'm sorry. If our expenditures met our revenues, you could see that we're looking at a 7 million mill levy to keep moving forward. And how we package that with the operational, a PI, a bond levy, still has to be determined. But I'm just trying to use this to educate incremental costs. Questions?
Ben.
I will give this some more study between now and Monday, and I'm excited to talk about it with the full board on Monday. I just took a quick scan through the slides as they posted. And what's posted for the growth plan part 2 is a $500,000 savings.
First year, yes.
But it doesn't, the slide just says 500. I think it doesn't say that also, unless you double click and go into the spreadsheet and see that actually even the very next year, it's almost $1 million out of costs. And then the year after that, it's $1 million out of costs.
That economics page, and we went in through and tried to identify what was one-time spend and what was recurring. And that's our best thinking at this point. But it is, so there is a first year savings. So the first year savings goes from 31 positions savings. It's a negative $4 million that offsets all the first time costs in the first year.
Yeah. And I saw about 31 FTEs. Now those are people who are losing their jobs, or those are positions that are not filled. Like what is, we can also talk about this on Monday, but I just.
So nobody's gonna lose their job.
I got it. It's just helpful to see that we should, if we're doing long-term thinking, we should think of an added $900,000 per year.
There's more information to be added because I believe the transportation savings that are in that negative 500 that are offsets 1.8 million. 1.1 of it is SEPA. The other one is the changes, the savings in buses for removing the Wood or Silverton or Woodford, I can't remember which school had that grandfather clause in.
Silverton.
So we don't know yet the corridor savings. So that's going to be an added going forward in the future too. As we get more efficient.
We're gonna have to approve it before we know what those numbers are.
You know? Okay. I don't know. I mean, that's something for Monday night.
Yeah, we can talk Monday. Yeah, and I know it's late. This is so, first of all, thank you really helpful to see the numbers. I'm excited to talk more about it Monday.
I appreciate, but one, we actually have to do it because it's an obligation. So it's something the board actually has to do. So I think this is one of those things that at times we don't spend enough time on the things that we actually have to do, and we spend so much time on things that we don't. So the 5-year forecast is a thing that we should be spending more time discussing and talking through. So I appreciate you all doing this work with us. Yeah.
Right, so,
that.
and we don't have time to go into all these details because we go into more details on the whole budget
Yep.
process at the next one. But I do want to say that you're looking at the data on Monday night, your next board meeting is December 9th. We have an obligation to get staffing to schools on December 13th, so that gives us
Absolutely.
4 days.
Absolutely.
I'm not even sure we could do that in 4 days to be accurate. So I actually asked the board president this morning, is there a way to get a meeting in between? So it gives us more time to be accurate. Otherwise, we're not gonna be able to meet our collaborate.
Yes.
CBA.
Which is what we've been trying to do as part of this meeting, as part of this particular committee, is get us ahead of the game so that we're actually getting things done on time. And so that's again another thing that the board is responsible for doing, and I appreciate you all assisting in that. I mean, I will say it, and I'll say it on Monday as well. I have a lot of beliefs that there will not be savings, and that some of these things will not occur the way we are projecting them to occur because of other reasons with regards to where enrollment will be affected.
Right.
Because I think the biggest thing that is a whole for me is I think we're making assumptions about people's desires and patterns of behavior with regard to enrollment that will not necessarily materialize. And we saw that
Right.
with
So
peer
this-
review and others.
I'm sorry, this
Mhm.
assumption, this plan is built on the assumption that the current year students will all promote to 1 year and they'll go to the place where the growth plan says they're gonna go. And that we stick strictly to formula staffing, which it's not reasonable to know that we do that because kids don't fall out in a perfect
Yep.
little pocket, so. It's just math and it's just a forecast.
Yes. And I think that's the thing for me. And we'll talk more about it on Monday, but I just have a firm belief our phase 1 tells us that the projections that we said would happen aren't necessarily going to happen. And so that's a thing for us to discuss. That's why enrollment matters when we talk about these things and these issues changes. So the only other thing I would want to just kind of hit on the 5-year plan here, and Jen, from the wonderful chart that you put together for us, because I appreciate it. This is also something we'll talk about with regards to what levies we want to do and that type of deal. But I think to your point, growth plan 3 may not be something we feasibly can say can be done until we get rid of the last bond levy. And I just think that's just an honest point that we can't do a new bond levy till we get rid of the past bond levy.
So I think the earliest you could go to the ballot on that would be November 30.
So I mean, like it's one of those things. Is a reality. We can't put in something we functionally can't do it until we get rid of this. If we're going to use that method, and so I just think that's something for the board to be thinking about. Really quick, Julie, because we're already over
Yeah,
time.
very quick. When you look at schools enrollment and the cost per student, the smaller the school, the less efficient it is.
Mhm.
And so some of those schools that are under 300 are costing $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 per child. The classes are so small sometimes, but we're not really the kids are not getting full services because the building's too small. And until you have capacity for efficiencies, you're not going to have any savings.
Well, again, I think my issue with our discussion about savings is that I don't honestly believe the enrollment numbers will stay the same when you change people's buildings, especially students who have changed 2 or 3 times now in the last year. I just don't think that's a feasible assumption to make.
Right, and this also assumes that our 7th and 8th grade classrooms are gonna get staffed the way we've been doing them. I don't know that the middle school concept would allow or would recommend that. I don't know yet.
Yeah. So I mean, those are things we'll talk about on Monday. But it's a reality that yes, we have reasons to need to address our facilities and how our facilities are being utilized. I just think we have to be very conscious of the fact that parents make decisions also, and they don't care why we made a decision. They care about what their child gets.
So
Let's keep moving forward though, so we can get to, but yes, go ahead, Jim. Sorry.
we just need direction from the finance committee. Do we want to do the balanced budget approach on the forecast? Or
Yes.
do the net? Okay. Thank you.
We don't have an option. So. Let's move to just quick updates with regard to the budget timeline.
Yeah, so I put a slide out here of like a draft budget plan. We need to gather the troops. But we need to go through and identify if there's gonna be any staffing formula changes. I did present the Title I decision tree to the principals and asked for feedback. I got two complaints. One wants to go back to school like bull. And the other one just wants more flexibility, but the, so we need to do, and we've talked to, HR about how to be more efficient in when we're doing the staffing as we're building the budget and keeping live data updated to the budget. So because we start working on next year's budget, life still continues in the current year. And so we get out of sync on positions when that happens. But, and then I believe, Mr. Gollyhue's almost done with student projections. Okay. So, so we have a bunch of actions to do. We're starting to gather the troops and we'll keep everybody updated. And then I just had a slide on what's the Just Ask Jen schedule.
And then just again, for those who were not able to attend the last Just Ask Jen, we had a lot of deep discussion, and great talks. I think this next one is all about levies. So if you want to know about a levy and all the information that goes into how we think about our levies here, please join us. The only other thing with regard to the budget plan, and I think this is important for us to note, a lot of what we need to do at this next board meeting or in a in-between meeting before the first in December is to give the direction so that we can make those projections and do the staffing. The hope, though, is that when we get to January, we'd have staffing, we'd have some of these discussions already starting to have been completed or being reviewed and that type of deal, so that we could get to kind of that March, April, full understanding of where we're going to be as a budget, right?
Correct.
Okay. Because again, I think what we've done in the last couple of years is we've never made it to March, April with even having the staffing situations figured out. So that would be a great accomplishment for us this year to get us back in normal order.
We appreciate CFT's patience with that process.
Yes, appreciate and in fact, all the unions who were very patient over the last couple of years, especially given our more recent budget concerns coming out of COVID. So, last thing I will do is just recognize that we have a few topics that are coming up for the next couple meetings. Specifically, we have our annual tax budget. And I will talk with Lauren about just kind of giving an update from our internal audit team and see where they're at and any fun things to report out to us. We have our last cycle of the mid-year vendor contract performance evaluation. So Cody and the crew will give us our last set of updates on the contracts. And then we also have potentially a couple of finance policies. Do we have some folks online who? We don't, but you'll be in. Yeah, sure.
If you'd like to speak during the speaking of the public session, please click the hand icon now and we will ask your name and school association.
And so before we'll give them a couple minutes for that, but we have a couple of finance policies that again will come before us. We talked a little bit about one already, and then we'll talk a little bit about another one for next month. While we wait, is there any other short comments within the room? Julie?
I know that you keep saying that people are going to walk and leave and go to other districts, and well, kind of. You said parents have, if we start moving kids around, they may not stay in our district. But I have been in this position for 16 years, in the district for 35 years. I've gone from a K-2 school to a K-8 school to a 7-12 school to, I mean, we've had everything in between. As we have done that, we have really lost very few kids. But I will say this, in Cleveland, when I started in this job, they had 80,000 students. We had 37,000. We now have more students than Cleveland because Cleveland, they did not make the kinds of changes that we were making to make the system more efficient. So it isn't like we have to open up more seats in the schools where people want to go so that more families can come to CPS, because there are schools with waiting lists.
I don't disagree, Julie. My point was that I think we have to acknowledge that the last phase 1 transition did not result in the numbers that we said it would. And that is my point going forward. is that we have to acknowledge that sometimes parents will make a decision that we may not agree with because they view stability as more important than how many kids are in a building.
What
That's it, Julie, that is all I'm saying. That is
What
all we have time
numbers
for.
did we not
Julie, we can
meet?
talk about that later offline, but for the purpose of this meeting, enrollment numbers are something that we have to look at to determine whether or not it will be a cost savings or not. Do we have anyone online who would like to make any